Imagine pulling up to the gas station tomorrow morning, completely unbothered, just going about your normal routine. You reach for the nozzle, you glance up at the digital display, and the price isn't $3 a gallon.
Right?
It isn't even $5. It's $15 a gallon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then imagine checking the news and seeing that half the world's commercial fishing fleets have been permanently docked. Global crop yields are projected to plunge by 10% overnight, and massive manufacturing hubs across East Asia are experiencing rolling, indefinite blackouts.
I mean, it sounds like the opening montage of a dystopian science fiction film, right? Like the kind of sudden, catastrophic societal collapse we really only expect to see after an asteroid strike or, a zombie outbreak.
Exactly. But today, we are unpacking a geopolitical analysis that argues this scenario isn't fiction at all. In fact, it argues that this is the mathematical, highly probable endpoint of three specific historical timelines that are, well, violently colliding right now. So welcome to the Deep Dive. We are so thrilled to have you here with us.
Absolutely.
Our mission today is to pull apart a remarkably dense, highly provocative, and frankly, deeply alarming assessment of the current global order. We're working from an excerpted transcript of a wide-ranging interview with geopolitical analyst Einar Kanjan. He describes our current era as the age of irrationality, and he maps out the interconnected crises burning through the Middle East, East Asia, the global economy, and, the very foundation of Western hegemony.
And before we dive into the actual mechanics of how a localized conflict could potentially trigger a global depression, we really need to establish a strict, very clear framework for this discussion.
Yes, very important.
Tangen's analysis contains highly charged political viewpoints regarding the United States, Israel, Iran, China, Europe, and basically the whole concept of global leadership itself. So, to be incredibly clear to you listening, we are not taking sides.
Right, not at all.
We are not endorsing these claims, nor are we condemning them. Our sole goal today is strictly to report impartially on the viewpoints and arguments presented in this specific source material. We're acting purely as your guides to help you understand the logic and, honestly, the sheer scale of what is being discussed in this text.
Yeah, consider us the translators for the terrain. And the terrain this analysis maps out is treacherous. The core thesis, the hook that makes this material so compelling, is that the chaos we see on the news isn't random.
Yeah, not at all.
It's the result of decisions made decades ago. Tangen argues that we are staring down the barrel of oil skyrocketing to $300 a barrel, the definitive and messy end of Western global dominance, and a potential repeat of the catastrophic conditions that led to the 1648 Peace of Westphalia.
Which is huge. And to understand how we arrived at this precipice, Tangen insists we have to rewind the clock. Looking at today's headlines in isolation is, well, it's like trying to understand a fire by only looking at the smoke. We have to look at the historical fuses that were lit years, sometimes decades ago, which are only just now reaching the powder keg.
All right, so let's follow that first fuse. Tangen's analysis points to three intersecting timelines. And timeline number one does not start with a recent drone strike or a modern border skirmish. It actually starts back in 1996.
Yeah, a long time ago.
For context, we are talking about the era of dial-up internet, the Macarena, Blockbuster video stores. What specific geopolitical shift happened in 1996 that Tangen claims is driving the missile strikes we are seeing today?
So according to this analysis, 1996 marks the introduction of a highly influential policy document known as the Clean Break Strategy. It was a report authored by a study group led by Richard Perle, and it was presented to Benjamin Netanyahu, who was serving his first term as Prime Minister of Israel at the time. Tangen argues that this document represented a seismic, fundamental shift in the underlying philosophy of Israeli security strategy.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the Middle East has obviously been volatile for far longer than 30 years. So how dramatic of a shift are we really talking about?
The shift is entirely about the approach to that volatility. Prior to the Clean Break report, the prevailing framework, at least nominally and certainly in the eyes of the international community, was focused on a two-state solution.
Right, the peace process.
Exactly. It was based on the concept of accommodation. The idea was to negotiate some kind of tense but functional, peaceful coexistence with surrounding Arab nations and the Palestinian territories. It was the whole philosophy behind the Oslo Accords. Tangen claims the Clean Break report essentially threw that entire philosophy out the window.
So instead of trying to find a table to sit at, what was the new directive?
The new directive was regional dominance through destabilization. The strategy outlined that the future security of Israel should not be based on land for peace compromises, but rather on actively and continuously undermining any potential rival nations in the region.
Wow.
The logic is that if your neighbors are constantly off balance, fractured or dealing with internal chaos, they cannot pose a unified threat to you. You secure your borders not by shaking hands, but by ensuring no one around you is strong enough to throw a punch.
I mean, it's very aggressive posture. It essentially demands that you are always on the offensive, constantly keeping the plate spinning to ensure your neighbors remain weakened.
Right. And Tangent notes that while Israeli leadership may have publicly downplayed this strategy at various points for diplomatic reasons, the underlying drumbeat has remained remarkably consistent for nearly 3 decades. And the primary focus of this dominant stratagem eventually zeroed in on Iran.
Okay.
Following the fall of the Shah in 1979, Iran pivoted to a fiercely anti-Israel bellicose stance. Tanjan argues that for 30 years there has been a continuous narrative pushed by Netanyahu and others that Iran is perpetually 2 weeks or 2 months away from obtaining a nuclear weapon. Iran became the ultimate target that needed to be kept off balance.
But here's where the analysis brings in a physical reality check that I found absolutely fascinating. Because strategies on paper are one thing, but geography is undefeated. Let's look at the sheer demographics in the map here. Israel has a population of roughly 7.5 million Jewish citizens. Iran has a population of over 92 million people.
Yeah, the scale is completely different.
And furthermore, if you look at a globe, there's roughly 1,000 miles of incredibly difficult, often hostile territory between Jerusalem and Tehran.
Geography dictates strategy, right? And Tangent emphasizes that it is physically impossible for Israel to mount a conventional boots-on-the-ground invasion of Iran. You simply cannot conquer a nation of 92 million people located 1,000 miles away with a military drawn from a fraction of that population.
Especially when you consider what Iran actually looks like topographically. We're talking about rolling, flat plains where tanks can just cruise at highway speeds.
Oh, far from it. Iran is the 17th largest country in the world by land mass, and, more importantly, it's a geographic fortress. It is ringed by the Zagros and Elburz mountain ranges. These are massive, jagged, imposing mountains that create an absolute logistical nightmare for an invading army.
I think the text compares it to Afghanistan, right?
Yes, explicitly compares the terrain to Afghanistan, a landscape historically famous for being the graveyard of empires because it is perfectly suited for asymmetric guerrilla warfare and ambushes. Even if an invading force could miraculously cross the 1,000 miles to get to the Iranian border, moving heavy machinery, supply lines, and infantry through those mountainy passes would be a quagmire of epic proportions.
Okay, so if we accept Tangent's premise for Timeline 1, that Israel adopted a strategy of regional dominance that requires neutralizing Iran, but they physically lack the manpower and the geographic proximity to do it themselves, which is the natural conclusion. The analysis claims that for 30 years, Israel has desperately needed the United States to step in, use its massive military apparatus, and do the heavy lifting for them, which perfectly transitions us into Timeline number 2.
Yes, the second timeline, Tangent identifies, shifts the focus entirely away from the Middle East and directly into the domestic political machinery of the United States. Specifically, the analysis homes in on the administration of Donald Trump. Tangent presents a scenario where the Trump administration was facing severe, compounding domestic crises.
We're talking about the full spectrum of political nightmares for a sitting president.
Exactly. The text references the Epstein files, the failure to push through key domestic policy agendas, and swirling, blatant allegations of corruption. The administration was bleeding political capital and facing a very hostile press corps that was digging relentlessly into these domestic scandals.
And Tangent introduces a brilliant, incredibly vivid analogy here to explain how politicians handle that kind of pressure, the concept of dead cats and white rabbits. Have you encountered this specific phrasing before?
It is a spectacularly effective visual metaphor for the mechanics of political distraction. The phrasing itself is often attributed to political strategists like Linton Crosby, actually.
Okay, let's walk through how this works because I just love this analogy and it's so applicable. Imagine you are a politician in deep trouble. The press is hounding you. The public is angry about a failing economy or a corruption scandal, and the narrative is completely out of your control. You cannot defend against the actual accusations because they are too damaging. So what is the strategy? You throw a metaphorical dead cat right onto the center of the dining room table.
It is a jarring action designed to completely hijack the attention of everyone in the room.
Right. If someone throws a dead cat on the table, nobody is going to keep talking about tax policy or corruption. The press dutifully looks at the table and screams, "Oh my gosh, what is that? Why is there a dead cat?"
Exactly.
You've successfully changed the subject. But that's only step one. While everyone is staring in horror at the dead cat, you execute step two. You release a bunch of white rabbits into the room.
And in this metaphor, the white rabbits are the outrageous statements, the late-night social media posts, the bizarre claims, and the blatant untruth.
Right? They are hopping all over the room, highly visible, fast-moving, and erratic. And the press, bless them, they just start chasing the bunnies.
Yeah.
They spend all their time and energy trying to catch these little white rabbits, fact-checking the absurd statements, analyzing the crazy tweets, and completely ignoring the original, incredibly damaging domestic scandal that started the whole mess. I mean, it is a masterclass in diversionary tactics.
It really is. And what Tangent does in this analysis is tie that domestic diversionary tactic directly into the geopolitical powder keg. Throwing dead cats and releasing rabbits on social media works for a while, but eventually the public gets fatigued.
Sure.
Tangent argues that for Trump, the standard domestic distractions weren't fully working to bury his biggest scandals anymore, so he started looking at foreign intervention as the ultimate dead cat.
Because nothing rallies a country and changes a news cycle quite like a military conflict.
Exactly. The text points out that the administration briefly attempted this with Venezuela, putting a pressure and focus on regime change there. It changed the narrative temporarily. Seeing this, Tangent alleges that people within Trump's orbit, specifically including Benjamin Netanyahu, who the text notes supposedly spent 4 days at the White House during this critical period, pitched the president on a similar, but much grander, strategy involving Iran.
They pitched a decapitation strike.
Yes, the concept of a decapitation strike is highly appealing to a leader looking for a quick, decisive victory. The pitch, according to Tangent's framework, was that the U.S. military could simply swoop in, execute targeted strikes to take out the top Iranian leadership and key infrastructure, and then just get out.
Like a clean hit.
Right. It wouldn't be a messy, drawn-out ground war. It would be surgical. Trump would emerge on the world stage as a strong, conquering hero who solved the Iran problem once and for all, and the resulting wave of patriotism would completely wash away his domestic legal and political troubles.
Okay, I have to pause here and throw a massive flag on the play. Let's look at this critically. If this plan was pitched to an embattled president as a slam-dunk, low-risk, high-reward political victory, why didn't it happen? I mean, why didn't the U.S. military just launch the jets and roll in?
Because, according to Tangent, the professional intelligence and military apparatus of the United States looked at the plan and slammed the brakes hard. We are talking about the CIA and the Pentagon pushing back against the political desire for a strike.
On what grounds, though?
Two very distinct grounds. First, the intelligence community. Tangent reports that the CIA stated unequivocally that there was absolutely no imminent threat from Iran to justify a sudden, unprovoked decapitation strike. The analysis makes a point of comparison here. Tangent notes that even in the lead-up to the Iraq War, which she explicitly characterizes in the text as being based on entirely fictitious premises, the U.S. government at least took the time and effort to whip the American public and the international community into a frenzy.
Right, they laid groundwork.
Exactly. They laid groundwork, however flawed. In this scenario with Iran, there was zero groundwork. A sudden strike would be viewed globally as naked, unjustified aggression.
And what about the Pentagon? Because the military's objection wasn't about public relations, was it? It was about pure, unfeeling mathematics.
It was an equation of survival. The military supposedly briefed the administration on the reality of the theater. The United States has a massive but finite presence in the Middle East. They have regional bases in places like Qatar, Bahrain, and Iraq. At these bases, they have a specific, quantifiable number of defensive missile systems. Patriot batteries, countermeasures, intersection technologies.
The finite shield.
Finite shield, exactly. Yeah. Tangent states that the Pentagon looked at Iran's capabilities and delivered a sobering assessment. Iran possesses roughly 10 times the number of offensive missiles as the U.S. has defensive countermeasures in the immediate region.
10 times. I mean, let that sink in for a second. For every one interceptor the U.S. could fire, Iran could launch 10 incoming rockets.
It is a scenario of sheer overwhelming volume. The military's conclusion was stark. They told the administration that if the U.S. initiates a decapitation strike, Iran will not simply absorb the blow. They will retaliate by unloading their massive stockpile of missiles against every U.S. base and asset in the region. No defensive system in the world is 100% effective, and when faced with a 10-to-1 numerical disadvantage, the U.S. defenses would be completely saturated and overwhelmed.
Which means the U.S. faces an impossible choice.
Exactly. The military warned that the U.S. would either be forced to immediately and humiliatingly withdraw its forces from the Middle East to save them, or those bases and the personnel stationed there would be systematically destroyed. The juice, militarily speaking, was simply not worth the squeeze.
And this mathematical reality perfectly bridges us to timeline number 3. We have Israel's 1996 strategy of regional dominance that requires U.S. intervention. We have the U.S. domestic political desire for a distraction, which is ultimately restrained by the Pentagon's stark assessment of missile math. And that brings us to the target of all this maneuvering, Iran. Timeline 3 focuses on Iran's 20-year asymmetric preparation.
Right, and Tangen's analysis makes it clear that Iran has not been sitting idly by, passively hoping they don't get bombed. They have agency, and they have been observing the geopolitical landscape very astutely. For the last 2 decades, Iranian leadership has operated under the fundamental assumption that a United States attack is not just possible, but inevitable. They have built their entire national defense strategy around anticipating that strike.
But they also know they can't win a traditional war. If they try to line up tanks against American Abrams or fly their aging Air Force against American F-35s, they lose, and they lose quickly.
They are acutely aware of their conventional military inferiority compared to the United States. They know they cannot fight toe-to-toe in a symmetric conflict of marching armies and carrier strike groups. Therefore, Tangen explains, their entire strategic doctrine has shifted to asymmetry and delay.
They're redefining the terms of the war.
Exactly. They are preparing for a conflict where they don't have to achieve a military victory on a traditional battlefield. They don't have to conquer territory or sink an entire U.S. fleet. Their strategy is entirely based on deterrence through unacceptable cost. They just have to make the economic and global consequence of engaging them so astronomically high, so painful, that it breaks the very system the U.S. and its allies rely upon.
And that concept of unacceptable cost moves us out of the theoretical strategy rooms in Washington and Tehran and into a reality that directly, immediately threatens the wallet, the job security, and the daily life of every single person listening to this right now. We need to talk about the physical geography of global commerce. We need to talk about the choke point of the world.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Let's visualize this. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow ribbon of water connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the open ocean. At its narrowest point, it is only about 21 miles wide. And the shipping lanes, the deep water channels that massive oil tankers actually need to navigate, are only 2 miles wide in either direction. And the entire northern coast of this strait is controlled by Iran. Tangen spells it out very clearly. Iran's ultimate asymmetric weapon, their geographical trump card, is their ability to bottle up this specific body of water.
What's fascinating here is the leverage they hold over this narrow passage. It is terrifying when you look at the global economic reliance on it. Roughly 20% of the world's total exported oil flows through that 2-mile-wide channel. 1/5 of the global supply constantly moving in slow, massive tankers right where the Iranian military can reach out and touch them with anti-ship missiles, fast attack boats, sea mines, or drone swarms.
Wait, let me play devil's advocate here for you listening. Shutting down the Strait of Hormuz hurts Iran too, doesn't it? Their own economy is heavily reliant on exporting oil through that exact same body of water. Are they really willing to trigger a mutual economic suicide pact just to spite the U.S. and Israel?
That is the defining question of deterrence. Tangen's analysis suggests that in a scenario where Iran is facing an existential threat, a decapitation strike, or a massive bombing campaign designed to overthrow their government economic self-preservation just goes out the window. If your house is already on fire, you don't care about the water damage from the fire hoses.
That's a great point.
In an all-or-nothing survival scenario, closing the strait is the only lever they have big enough to force the international community to intervene and stop the attack. They are banking on the fact that the rest of the world will capitulate to their demands rather than suffer the economic consequences.
And to understand the sheer devastation those economic consequences would entail, Tangen uses a brilliant and deeply unsettling historical parallel. We have to look at the 1973 oil crisis.
The OPEC embargo. It is the perfect case study for understanding how fragile the global energy market truly is. In 1973, in response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, the Arab members of OPEC instituted an oil embargo. They cut off a portion of the world's available oil supply.
Do you know what the actual percentage of that cut was? When we think of the 70s oil crisis, we think of endless lines at the gas station, rationing based on license plate numbers and economic stagflation. You would assume they cut the world's supply in half.
Right, but according to Tangent's data, it was remarkably small. The total reduction in available global oil during that crisis was only between 7 to 9%.
A 7 to 9% drop. On paper, a 93% supply level doesn't sound apocalyptic. You'd think the market could absorb that.
But the energy market operates on incredibly tight margins. It isn't just about volume, it's about the panic of scarcity. That relatively small 7 to 9% drop caused global oil prices to quadruple. Tangent notes that a barrel of oil went from roughly $10 to $40 almost overnight. The macroeconomic shockwaves were profound. It triggered a global recession, massive inflation, and fundamentally altered global political dynamics for a decade.
Okay, so let's apply Tangent's terrifying math to the present day. If a 7 to 9% cut in 1973 quadrupled prices and caused a global recession, what happens if Iran pulls their geographic lever, closes the Strait of Hormuz, and chokes off 20% of the global supply? We're talking about losing more than double the volume that caused the 70s crisis.
The analysis predicts a catastrophic, unprecedented spike. Tangent estimates that if that 20% is removed from the board, oil will skyrocket from its current baseline of roughly $80 a barrel straight up to $200 or even $300 a barrel.
$300 a barrel.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to my $15 a gallon gas station scenario from the beginning of the show. But wait, surely we are better prepared today, right? We hear politicians talk constantly about American energy independence. If the Middle East goes offline, can't the massive U.S. fracking industry just step up, pump more oil, and fill the gap? And what about the green energy transition? We have solar, wind, EVs. We aren't as utterly beholden to fossil fuels as we were in 1973.
Tangent addresses both of those hopes very systematically, and he shoots them down with cold logistical facts. Let's tackle the fracking argument first. The idea that the U.S. can just turn a dial and replace 20 million missing barrels a day is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the industry works. The text states that the U.S. government has already consulted with the domestic fracking industry about emergency capacity.
And what did the frackers say?
They said no. They explained that they absolutely cannot cover a 20 million barrel a day shortfall. Extracting oil isn't like turning on a faucet. It requires massive capital investment, deploying hundreds of new rigs, hiring specialized labor, and building new pipeline infrastructure. The industry told the government that over time, with maximum effort, they could perhaps ramp up production by 1, 2, or maybe 3 million extra barrels a day.
So even running at maximum overdrive, they're only making up 10 to 15% of what was lost. It's a drop in the bucket.
Exactly. It is physically, financially, and logistically impossible for domestic U.S. production to replace the sheer volume of oil flowing through the Strait of Hormuz in the short term. And regarding the green energy transition, Tangent is equally blunt about our current reality. Yes, we are building solar panels and wind turbines, but the backbone of global commerce still drinks liquid fossil fuels. You cannot run a commercial Boeing 777 on wind power or good intentions. They require aviation fuel. You cannot instantly swap out the global supply chain's fleet of millions of heavy-duty transport trucks to electric batteries overnight. They require massive, continuous amounts of diesel.
The text even specifically mentions ethanol corn fuel as a proposed alternative, right?
It does. And it notes that while politicians might try to gin up production of corn fuel to ease the panic, the reality of the chemistry and the infrastructure is unforgiving. The sheer amount of agricultural processing required to create ethanol is tremendous, and the industrial capacity simply does not exist on this planet to refine enough corn to replace 20 million barrels of crude oil a day. We are locked into a sprawling, globalized fossil fuel infrastructure, and there is absolutely no quick release valve if 20% of it suddenly vanishes.
This is where Tangent's analysis moves from macroeconomic theory to devastating ground-level reality. He maps out how tightly interconnected the global supply chain truly is. It is not just about the pain of paying more to commute to work. A $300 barrel of oil creates a ripple effect that tears through everything humanity needs to survive. And the analysis provides this incredible specific microcosm to illustrate the point: the fishing fleets in Thailand.
It is a perfect granular example of how energy markets dictate food security.
Right. So if global oil prices spike to $300, the price of diesel fuel skyrockets proportionately. Commercial fishing boats are massive, heavy vessels that drag enormous nets through the ocean. They burn astronomical amounts of diesel. Tangent points out that even prior to this hypothetical super spike, when oil prices merely fluctuated upward recently, half of Thailand's massive commercial fishing fleet refused to leave port. They literally tethered their boats to the docks.
Why? Because the math no longer worked? The cost of the diesel required to fuel the voyage was higher than the wholesale value of the fish they would catch. They were losing money every time they turned the engines on.
And if the boats don't go out, the fish don't get caught. And for the remaining boats that do brave the seas and pay that exorbitant diesel cost, they aren't going to absorb that loss. They have to pass that inflated operating cost down the line to the distributors, the grocery stores, and ultimately to the consumer. So suddenly, a vital source of protein becomes incredibly expensive.
But the food crisis doesn't stop at the oceans. Tangent highlights an even more critical vulnerability that most people never think about. He points out that 40% of the world's fertilizers originate in the Middle East.
I think this is a point we really need to sit with. Wait, 40%?
Yes.
Modern agriculture is not just dirt, water, and seeds. It is an intensely industrialized process that is completely dependent on synthetic fertilizers, specifically nitrogen fertilizers, created through the Haber-Bosch process.
Yeah.
And what is the primary ingredient for that process? Natural gas and fossil fuels.
Precisely. The Middle East isn't just an energy hub, it is the foundational pillar of the global agricultural supply chain. If the Strait of Hormuz is locked down and that 40% fertilizer supply vanishes from the global market, what happens to crop yields around the world?
They plummet
Yeah.
instantly. You can't just ask the soil to work harder.
No. Without those synthetic inputs, modern farming output collapses. So you were looking at a cascading, multi-front failure. Fuel becomes utterly unaffordable, which makes catching fish and physically transporting food on trucks unaffordable. Simultaneously, the fundamental ability to grow the food collapses because there is no fertilizer.
It's a terrifying convergence. Kanjan zeroes in on East Asia as being particularly, almost existentially, vulnerable to this exact scenario. Let's look at Japan. The analysis highlights that Japan imports a staggering 95% of its oil. And because it's an island nation, 100% of that oil arrives by sea, largely traversing the shipping lanes from the Persian Gulf.
They are entirely reliant on those maritime arteries staying open. Tangent states that Japan does not have years' worth of strategic reserves sitting in underground caverns. They might have enough stockpiled for a few weeks, perhaps a few months under strict rationing. If the strait closes, any alternative oil Japan can manage to secure on the open market will be at an astronomical premium.
Which would just wreck their economy.
Exactly. The analysis predicts this would trigger rampant, uncontrollable inflation, completely upending their economy and destroying their current fragile efforts at economic revitalization.
And the text doesn't stop at Japan. It specifically maps the vulnerability of India and Vietnam as well.
Yes, India is positioned in a terrible spot, according to Tangent's framework. You might assume India is insulated because they have secured agreements to buy discounted Russian oil. But Tangent points out that in a global shortage of this magnitude, the price of all oil rises.
Even the discounted stuff.
Right. Even discounted Russian oil will become prohibitively expensive for a developing economy. The analysis predicts that India would face severe energy rationing, leading to rolling brownouts and widespread blackouts across the country as they struggle to afford the fuel needed to keep their power grid functioning.
And Vietnam. They've been held up recently as the new darling of global manufacturing.
They have. Vietnam has become a massive manufacturing hub. But Tangent notes a cynical reality. Much of Vietnam's manufacturing boom is essentially acting as a pass-through for Chinese goods. Chinese companies set up factories in Vietnam to label their products made in Vietnam to bypass U.S. tariffs.
Ah, clever.
But regardless of the origin, those factories require massive amounts of energy to run. If energy costs skyrocket globally, Vietnam's competitive advantage evaporates. Their export economy would be crippled, factories would shutter, and millions of workers would be displaced.
So when we synthesize all of this, when Timeline 3 reaches its climax and Iran pulls the geographic lever to close the choke point of the world, Tangent warns that the ultimate result is not just a recession. It is a sudden, violent global depression.
A global depression accompanied by a terrifying surge in massive civil unrest. Tangent is deeply pragmatic about human nature. When complex economies fail, when grocery store shelves empty out, and when heating fuel becomes a luxury, people naturally look for someone to blame. Societal trust evaporates. It quickly degrades into a zero-sum survivalist mindset of I get it or you get it. That is an incredibly dangerous, volatile psychological state for a global population to enter.
Okay, I need everyone to take a deep breath, because as harrowing as the prospect of a global economic depression and cascading food shortages is, Kanjan argues that this economic devastation is merely the precursor. It is the catalyst that forces desperate hands. And that realization plunges us into the darkest, most alarming section of this deep dive, the nuclear precipice.
The logic here is grim, but straightforward. As the economic devastation spreads globally and as conventional military options fail to break the stalemate or achieve the desired political results, Tangent warns that cornered leaders might turn to the unthinkable. When you run out of conventional levers, you look at the unconventional ones.
Right. And here's where Tangent lays out the chilling arithmetic of the region. The United States possesses roughly 5,000 nuclear warheads. Israel, while maintaining a policy of deliberate ambiguity, is widely estimated by international observers to possess an undeclared stockpile of somewhere between 110 and 120 nuclear weapons.
And Tangent argues that to understand the risk of those weapons being used, you have to understand the profound psychological shift currently happening within Israel. For a very long time, the Israeli public and its leadership felt heavily insulated by the Iron Dome air defense system. It provided this powerful illusion of invulnerability.
Yeah, we've all seen the videos of it intercepting rockets in the sky.
Right. Yes, an erratic rocket from Gaza or Lebanon might slip through occasionally, causing localized tragedy, but the nation as a whole felt fundamentally safe from mass, sustained destruction. They believed the sky was shielded.
But the analysis claims that illusion is shattering right now in real time.
Exactly. Tangent points out that in the current escalating conflicts, the volume and sophistication of incoming fire are changing. For the first time in modern memory, Israel is genuinely getting pummeled. The Iron Dome is experiencing saturation. They are suffering real, sustained damage to infrastructure. They are experiencing the kind of visceral, unpredictable war on their own soil that they have historically only fought on others' territory. The shield is cracking.
But how does a failing air defense system directly lead to a leader authorizing a nuclear strike? What is the specific mechanism of escalation Tangent is worried about?
He outlines a very specific convergence of psychological desperation and political survival. Consider the position of Prime Minister Netanyahu in this scenario. He is under immense, compounding domestic threat. He has faced massive protests, lawsuits, criminal charges, and the looming threat of total political and personal ruin if he loses power.
He is a leader backed into a corner.
A very tight corner. Tangent fears that if this conflict drags on, and the United States, perhaps reeling from the economic collapse we just discussed, decides the cost of involvement is simply too high and threatens to withdraw its protective umbrella, Netanyahu will be left isolated. A desperate leader facing the failure of conventional defenses and his own imprisonment might concoct a strategic justification to use a tactical nuclear weapon.
Just to shock the system.
Exactly. It would be framed as the ultimate, final show of force, a desperate attempt to shock the adversary into submission and assert absolute dominance when all other avenues have failed.
This is where Tangent's analysis gets terrifyingly specific. He doesn't just wave his hands and say, a nuke goes off and it's bad for the Middle East. He examines the atmospheric science of the region. He looks at the meteorology. I want you, listening right now, to visualize a map of the Middle East and Central Asia. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Tangent points out a crucial geographic reality. Iran sits exactly at the geographic intersection of the Eurasian jet stream.
The jet stream. These are the massive high-altitude rivers of wind that constantly circulate the planet in the troposphere, driving global weather patterns.
Yes. If a nuclear weapon is detonated over Iranian territory, the consequences are not contained to a blast radius. The explosion punches a column of radioactive debris high into the upper atmosphere. And because of Iran's specific location, that Eurasian jet stream catches the fallout. It acts like a global conveyor belt for radiation.
And where does that conveyor belt take the toxic cloud?
According to Tangent's meteorological assessment, the prevailing winds carry that radioactive particulate matter straight eastward. It sweeps directly across all the stand countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Kazakhstan. It moves directly over the densely populated agricultural heartlands of India. And eventually, those high-altitude wind currents carry the radiation completely around the northern hemisphere.
It transforms a regional strike into a global dispersal event.
Precisely. And Tangent cites estimates regarding the immediate environmental impact of such an event. Beyond the localized horror and widespread toxicity, injecting that much soot and radiation into the upper atmosphere causes severe climate anomalies. It disrupts rainfall patterns, leading to unpredictable catastrophic droughts in some regions and massive floods in others. The analysis estimates this would result in an immediate 10% global drop in crop productivity due to nuclear winter effects.
A 10% drop in global food production. And remember the context from 10 minutes ago. This is happening in a world where the Strait of Hormuz is closed, the global supply chains are already broken, diesel is unaffordable, and the Middle Eastern fertilizer shipments have completely stopped.
It is a compounding catastrophe. It is a recipe for global, unprecedented starvation.
Which means someone, somewhere, has to step in and stop this train before it goes over the cliff. If the United States is paralyzed by domestic politics, or viewed as an untrustworthy mediator, and Europe is largely following the U.S. lead who has left, Tangent suggests that another superpower is quietly maneuvering to step into the void and mediate. And that brings us to the next critical phase of the analysis, China's role and the transactional table.
Tangent observes that China has been watching this entire powder keg develop with intense, calculating pragmatism. They are not attempting to step in out of some altruistic desire for world peace. They are acting out of pure economic self-preservation. A global depression, the collapse of maritime shipping, and radioactive fallout decimating their trading partners are all incredibly bad for Chinese business and internal stability.
Tangent points out a really telling logistical detail about China's preparation, too. He looks at their recent purchasing behavior. In the months leading up to the current height of the crisis, China quietly, methodically increased their extra oil purchases by 16%.
Right. They weren't just buying what they needed for daily consumption, they were hoarding. Tangent estimates that through this quiet accumulation, China has built up a massive strategic reserve of roughly 1.1 billion barrels of oil.
Wow, over a billion.
Yeah, they clearly ran the geopolitical math, anticipated a severe disruption in the Middle East, and insulated themselves as best they could. But, as the text notes, even an ocean of oil 1.1 billion barrels eventually runs out when you are powering the largest manufacturing economy on Earth.
It just buys time.
The reserve is just a buffer, it's buying them time. China is desperate to construct a diplomatic solution to keep the global system from completely derailing before their clock runs down.
So how does China attempt to mediate a conflict where the two main combatants, Iran on one side and the U.S. and Israel on the other, absolutely despise each other? Kagan makes a fascinating point here about the mechanics of diplomacy. Iran simply will not negotiate directly with the United States.
According to the text, the well of trust is completely poisoned. Iran views past peace talks and agreements with the U.S. not as genuine diplomatic efforts, but as subterfuge. They see American diplomacy as a stalling tactic, a way to gather intelligence, or a setup for future betrayals and attacks. There is zero baseline trust. To the Iranian leadership, sitting across a table from American diplomats is viewed as naive and pointless.
So China has to propose a completely different architecture for diplomacy. They have to build a different kind of table.
Yes. Tangent suggests China envisions building a negotiating bloc comprised of middle powers. Rather than a bipolar showdown between the U.S. and Iran, China proposes a table that includes the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, regional powers like Turkey and Egypt, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and Israel.
It's a coalition of stakeholders.
Exactly. You build a massive coalition of regional and economic powers who all share one overriding vested interest. They desperately need the Middle East not to turn into radioactive glass, and they need the Strait of Hormuz to remain open. It leverages collective regional pressure rather than unilateral demands.
But here's the massive question I had when reading this section of Tangent's analysis. Why would leaders facing prison or ruin ever agree to stop fighting? If we connect this to the bigger picture, if you are an autocrat or a deeply embattled politician backed into a corner, wouldn't you just keep swinging until the bitter end? What possible motivation is there to sit at China's table?
That is the exact psychological knot that Tangent identifies as the key to avoiding escalation, and it requires a very unsentimental view of diplomacy. Tangent argues that to stop the conflict, both Donald Trump, if he returns to power, and Benjamin Netanyahu must be offered a carrot.
An alternative to their own destruction.
Exactly. Tangent is brutally blunt about the historical reality of leadership. As long as a leader is winning or in power, they are largely invulnerable. But once they lose, especially in volatile political climates, they face incarceration, prosecution, or violent overthrow. If you demand unconditional surrender from a leader in that precarious position, you leave them no choice. They will fight to the bitter apocalyptic end because they have nothing left to lose. Therefore, Tangent explains, China's mediation strategy involves finding an off-ramp and negotiated settlement that guarantees these leaders some measure of personal survival, political face-saving, or freedom from prosecution.
It's diplomacy based on self-interest rather than justice. And Tangent points out that China specifically keeps diplomatic channels open to Donald Trump because they fundamentally understand his psychology.
Tangent describes Trump's approach to the world as purely transactional. He argues that Trump does not operate on grand, multi-decade ideological frameworks or rigid moral dogmas. He operates on what is directly in front of him today. What tangible asset or victory can he secure right now?
The ultimate, what have you done for me lately mindset. What did you promise me yesterday? Doesn't matter. What can you hand me today?
Precisely. And Tangent suggests that from Beijing's perspective, a highly transactional leader is actually preferable in a crisis. A transactional leader is someone you can do a deal with. You can put specific, tangible benefits on the table, trade concessions, highly publicized diplomatic wins, economic incentives, and negotiate a de-escalation piece by piece. You bypass the ideological gridlock by focusing purely on immediate mutual self-interest.
But stepping back from the immediate tactics of who sits at what table and what carrot is offered to which leader, reading Tangent's analysis, you really have to wonder, why is all this destruction happening in the first place?
Yeah.
Why are immensely powerful, educated nations actively choosing paths like risking nuclear war or global depression that seem guaranteed to hurt themselves just as much as their enemies? This brings us to the underlying philosophical thesis of Tangent's entire deep dive. This is the core of what he calls the age of irrationality and the painful end of global hegemony.
This is where Tangent transitions from analyzing military logistics and economic supply chains to diagnosing the grand psychology of the global order. The overarching theory presented here is that the chaos we are witnessing is not a series of unfortunate accidents. It is the chaotic, violent thrashing of a system in its death throes. Tangent argues that we are witnessing the definitive end of Western dominance and unilateral global hegemony.
A shift in the tectonic plates of world power, moving away from a unipolar world ruled by Washington and European capital.
Yes, and Tangent argues a profound, historically validated point. When great, historically dominant powers begin to feel that they are in a state of relative decline, they do not go quietly into the night. They do not graciously step aside and offer to share the stage. Instead, they panic. They take extreme, irrational, and wildly disproportionate risks to try and reverse that decline and reassert their dominance.
It becomes an all-or-nothing mentality. The nuance disappears.
Precisely. Tangent points to the internal political messaging of the United States, specifically the slogan, "Make America Great Again," as a glaring symptom of this psychological state. The argument is that the U.S., and by extension its European allies, feel their historical grip on global affairs slipping away. Their response to this anxiety is entirely binary. Either we restore our total, unquestioned dominance over the global system, or we are willing to drive the entire world into the ground trying.
No.
In their minds, there is no acceptable middle ground of shared power or multipolar cooperation.
There's a specific quote from Tangent's interview that really stuck with me. He describes this current era as an age where people are feeling their way through life emotionally, they feel that they are victims, and as a result, they're more likely to victimize others.
It's a profound observation on how individual grassroots psychology scales up to become dangerous national policy.
Right. Think about the mechanism there. If an entire electorate feels economically left behind, culturally displaced, or victimized by the complexities of globalism, they become incredibly angry. They vote from a place of fear and grievance. They elect leaders who validate that anger and promise simple, aggressive, combative solutions.
Yeah.
And those leaders take power and immediately project that sense of victimhood onto the global stage. The national narrative becomes, we are being wronged by the world, therefore we are completely justified in wronging others to get what's ours. It becomes a self-perpetuating cycle of irrational aggression masked as self-defense.
And that victimhood cycle is toxic to diplomacy. Because if you view the other side not as a rational competitor with their own interests, but as the malicious source of your victimhood, compromise feels like a moral betrayal. You can't negotiate with the source of your trauma, you can only seek to destroy them. That is the essence of the age of irrationality Tangent describes.
Which begs the ultimate existential question. If this old Western-dominated world order is collapsing in a chaotic cycle of victimhood, aggression, and potential nuclear escalation, what is going to replace it? If unipolar hegemony is dead, what comes next? Tangent offers a really striking historical parallel to answer this, taking us back almost 400 years.
To understand the future Tangent envisions, he takes us deep into the 17th century, specifically to the conclusion of the 30 Years' War in 1648.
The 30 Years' War. For a quick historical refresher, this was the incredibly bloody conflict primarily fought in Central Europe, tearing the Holy Roman Empire apart along the fault lines of Catholics versus Protestants.
Yes, from 1618 to 1648. It was a period of unimaginable slaughter, plague, and famine. It wasn't just a war of armies, it was a war of annihilation that devastated the civilian population. Roving mercenary armies pillaged entire regions. Nations completely bankrupted their treasuries, fighting over religious supremacy and political dominance. The key dynamic was that no single power, not the Habsburgs, not the French, not the Swedes, was strong enough to completely conquer all the others, but they were all strong enough to keep the meat grinder running for 3 decades.
They kept fighting until they literally couldn't afford to buy another bullet or pay another mercenary.
Exactly. The bloodshed and the economic ruin reached a point of absolute, undeniable unsustainability. The continent was dying, and the result of that sheer exhaustion was the Peace of Westphalia. This wasn't just a treaty ending a war, it was a profound philosophical shift that established the foundational concept of the modern international system, the Westphalian system.
And what does that system actually entail, practically speaking? What did they agree to?
It established the principle of sovereign equality. It was a collective realization that the pursuit of absolute dominance was suicidal. The treaty essentially said, no single empire or religion is going to dominate everyone else. We agree to respect each other's defined borders, and we agree not to interfere in the internal domestic affairs of other sovereign states. As Tangent plainly translates it, it was a profound, exhausted agreement of you be you and I'll be me.
I love that summary.
Yeah, you manage your territory, I'll manage mine, and we stop trying to force our ideology on each other.
You be you, I'll be me. It sounds incredibly rational. It sounds so simple. So what does this all mean for today? The source says it's a you be you, I'll be me solution. Why can't modern leaders accept that? Why can't the West just look at the shifting global dynamics and say, okay, a multipolar world is fine. You manage your hemisphere, we'll manage ours. Let's just trade and avoid World War III.
Because, Tangent argues, and this is a very harsh systemic critique, the modern European and American political classes are ideologically incapable of imagining that reality. Tangent claims that Western leaders have been raised, educated, and conditioned for the last 35 years, ever since the end of the Cold War, to believe a very specific, almost religious narrative. They genuinely believe that Western global dominance is the literal prerequisite for world peace, the protection of human rights, and the survival of liberal democracy.
So in their worldview, hegemony and morality are the exact same thing. Dominance equals peace.
Yes. They view their hegemony not as an exercise of raw power, but as a uniquely moral force for good in the world. Therefore, to them, losing that dominance doesn't mean a graceful transition to a peaceful, multipolar Westphalian system of equals. To them, losing dominance means plunging the world back into a dark age of ruthless competition, tyranny, and barbarism. They literally cannot imagine an alternative to their own unilateral control that isn't apocalyptic.
And this leads to what is undoubtedly the most controversial intellectual leap in Tangent's entire analysis. I had to read this section twice to make sure I was following the logic. Tangent compares the modern, Western-led, rules-based international order directly to 19th century imperialism and colonialism.
It is a staggering comparison that challenges the core self-image of the West, but Tangent traces the logic very deliberately. He asks us to look at how historical colonialism functioned. Under the European empires of the 19th century, the world was rigidly divided into 2 distinct categories, the civilized nations and the barbarians.
Right, and those labels determined your rights.
Entirely. The civilized nations of Europe were granted sovereignty, they had rights, they made treaties, they respected each other's borders, mostly anyway. The barbarians, the colonized peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, did not have sovereignty. Furthermore, the empires justified this blatant theft of land and resources by claiming that colonizing the barbarians was actually a moral good. They called it a civilizing mission. It justified brutal military intervention under the guise of uplifting and educating the conquered populations.
Okay, so how does Tangent map that ugly 19th century dynamic onto the modern diplomacy of today?
Tangent argues that while the terminology has become much more polite, the underlying power structure is identical. Today, he argues, the West has simply replaced the word civilized with liberal democracies and the word barbarians with authoritarians.
Wow, that is a heavy accusation.
It is. The argument is that the West operates under the belief that only liberal democracies deserve full sovereignty and the absolute protection of international law. Authoritarian nations, by contrast, are viewed as inherently illegitimate. Because of this, Tangent argues, the West claims that its superior humanitarian ideals granted a moral exemption from the very international laws it claims to uphold.
Right, the exceptions.
Exactly. This allows the West to justify intervening militarily, applying crippling economic sanctions, or orchestrating the overthrow of governments wherever it deems necessary, framing these actions as a responsibility to protect or a defense of human rights, rather than what Tangent sees as imperial expansion and control.
And Tangent doesn't just leave this as an abstract academic theory. He points to a very specific real-world anecdote to prove that this imperial mindset is alive and well. He explicitly calls out comments allegedly made by U.S. Senator Marco Rubio at the Munich Security Conference.
Yes, this anecdote serves as the exclamation point on Tangent's thesis. The text claims that Senator Rubio essentially stood in front of an audience of European leaders and diplomats and expressed a profound nostalgia for the era of empire. Tangent alleges that Rubio framed the last 500 years, the era of Western empires conquering and spanning the globe, as a great stabilizing era for humanity. And conversely, he portrayed the post-WWII movement of global decolonization as a chaotic, communist-inspired plot that fundamentally undermined global stability.
Tangent is essentially saying that Rubio said the quiet part out loud, that the mask slipped, revealing a deep-seated desire to abandon the polite pretense of the rules-based order and just return to unapologetic neocolonial dominance. But the most alarming part of Tangent's anecdote isn't just what Rubio supposedly said, it's how the audience reacted. Tangent notes that a large portion of the European leaders and diplomats at that conference applauded him for it.
And Tangent explains exactly why they applauded. He concludes that European leaders are terrified of irrelevance. As long as the United States promises them a seat at the table of this restored Western dominance, as long as they are thrown a bone and allowed to be part of the civilized ruling class, they will eagerly support and applaud this neocolonial vision. They prefer the comfortable illusion of shared empire over accepting the terrifying reality of a multipolar Westphalian world where they are no longer the ultimate arbiters of global morality and power.
This has been an incredibly heavy, dense, and frankly exhausting journey. The scope of Tangent's analysis is staggering. Let's briefly retrace the path we just walked. We started with the 1996 clean break strategy, examining how the philosophy of dominance required keeping rivals like Iran perpetually off balance. We saw how the physical geography of the Middle East forced Israel to rely on U.S. military might.
Right, and then we explored how that geopolitical need intersected with the domestic political desperation of the Trump administration, the throwing of dead cats onto the media table, only to be thwarted by the Pentagon's stark mathematical reality that Iran possessed 10 times the missile capacity needed to overwhelm U.S. defenses.
Which led us to Iran's 20-year asymmetric strategy, bypassing a conventional war to focus entirely on the ultimate geographic choke point. We broke down the terrifying math of closing the Strait of Hormuz, comparing a potential 20% loss of global oil to the devastating 1973 OPEC crisis, predicting prices of $300 a barrel. We shattered the illusion that fracking or green energy could save us in the short term and traced the catastrophic ripple effects from grounded Thai fishing fleets to the collapse of the Middle Eastern fertilizer supply to rolling blackouts in India and the destruction of East Asian manufacturing.
And from that economic ruin, we stared over the nuclear precipice. We examined how the breakdown of the Iron Dome could corner a desperate leader like Netanyahu, raising the specter of a tactical strike that the Eurasian jet stream would catch, wrapping the Northern Hemisphere in radioactive fallout and plunging global crop yields by 10%. We saw China stepping into this void, pragmatically hoarding 1 billion barrels of oil and trying to build a transactional table of middle powers to offer these cornered leaders an alternative to mutual destruction.
And finally, we pulled back the lens to examine the profound philosophical clash at the heart of it all. We discussed the age of irrationality, how a Western hegemonic power in relative decline operates on a toxic, all-or-nothing victimhood mentality. We explored how the West clings to a neo-colonial rules-based order, terrified of surrendering to a 1648-style Westphalian system of true sovereign equality because they equate their own dominance with global morality.
It is a sweeping, deeply unsettling diagnosis of the modern world.
It really is. I want to remind everyone listening, While we have been discussing high-level geopolitical theory, troop movements, and macroeconomic philosophy, Tangent's analysis makes it abundantly clear this is not abstract. The collision of these three timelines dictates the cost of the groceries in your fridge, the price of the gas in your car, the stability of your job, and the fundamental physical safety of the world you live in.
And that leads to a final, lingering thought we want to leave you with, drawing on the overarching historical theme of Tangent's text. Tangent suggests that leaders and nations act most irrationally and most dangerously when they feel they are victims or when they feel their absolute dominance is slipping away. Look back at the long, bloody history of human civilization. Ask yourself, has a declining, dominant global power ever willingly, graciously, and peacefully surrendered its position at the top of the hierarchy to accommodate a multipolar system without triggering a cataclysmic conflict? Or are we truly unavoidably doomed to repeat the devastating, bankrupting slaughter that was required to force the 1648 Westphalian peace?
It really makes you look at the headlines differently, doesn't it? The waters are undeniably murky, the stakes are existential, and the historical precedents are grim. Keep questioning the narratives around you. Look past the smoke, search for the fuses, keep an eye out for the dead cats being thrown on the political table, and most importantly, stay curious. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.